on December 7, 1982, two men and two women climbed into a car parked outside the American embassy. A police officer stationed at the entrance noticed this and immediately reported it to the Committee for State Security. At that time, Soviet special services were monitoring the conversations of embassy employees through the city's telephone system. The KGB was already aware that several diplomats planned to gather for a birthday celebration that evening. What Soviet intelligence did not realize was that the two men entering the vehicle were in fact CIA officers. The supposed party was nothing more than a cover story. The large cake one of the women carried concealed a secret device. This was the beginning of a highly sophisticated operation, codenamed Jack in the Box. There are striking similarities between the work of magicians and that of spies. The central skill of both is the ability to misdirect an observer's attention. In this case, the Americans' audience was the watchful eyes of the USSR's security services. KGB surveillance teams almost always shadowed the vehicles of U.S. diplomats, following at a discreet distance. During such tailing operations, there were brief moments, such as when turning onto a side street when the diplomat's car was out of sight for just a few seconds. This fleeting window was all the time the Americans needed to perform their magic. That evening, the diplomat's car wound through Moscow streets. The man in the front passenger seat, under a layer of American-style clothing, was already dressed like a typical Soviet pensioner. On the lap of the woman behind him rested the cake, a mechanical device disguised as a dessert, modeled after the children's toy with a clown on a spring, the classic Jack in the Box. At around 7 p.m., the car turned onto the designated street. The driver eased the vehicle's speed, the passenger door opened, and the disguised agent stepped out. The woman in the back immediately placed the cake in his seat and pulled a hidden lever. Out sprang a life-size dummy, shaped to resemble the man who had just exited. The entire maneuver took only seconds. The CIA operative had barely taken a few steps along the sidewalk when the KGB tail car rounded the corner. From their vantage point, the Soviets still saw four figures inside the vehicle. The illusion had worked flawlessly, but this was far from the end of the operation. The agent, now free on foot, would alter his appearance further, ride several trams, and walk through multiple streets to ensure he had completely evaded surveillance. The man he was scheduled to meet was no ordinary contact. He was the most valuable spy the United States had in the Soviet Union, a billion-dollar asset. To most people, spies are almost mythical known, mainly from movies, without occasional news reports of arrests, exchanges, or deportations. They could easily be filed away alongside elves and unicorns. The story you are about to hear is like opening a door into a real-life spy Narnia, complete with all the tropes of a classic espionage thriller: safe houses, hidden cameras, lethal pills in pens, coded signals, surveillance and counter-surveillance, disguises, and encrypted messages. The difference is that this account is entirely factual. The individuals have real birth dates, death dates, and complete life stories. Our main subject was one of the most successful American intelligence operatives ever to work inside the USSR. The CIA itself was born out of disaster. In 1941, the attack on Pearl Harbor killed thousands of U.S. service members and destroyed or damaged dozens of ships. Later investigations concluded that one of the chief reasons for the tragedy was the failure of different U.S. intelligence agencies to coordinate effectively. To prevent such failures, the CIA was formally established in 1947, the first centralized intelligence service in U.S. history. Over time, the agency's mission grew to include espionage and covert operations, placing it squarely on the front lines of the Cold War. Its principal adversary was, of course, the Soviet Union. Much of the CIA's work involved gathering intelligence from outside the USSR via refugees, defectors, and Soviet military personnel posted abroad. But the agency knew the most valuable information could only be obtained from sources inside the Soviet Union itself. The challenge was immense. The Soviet state, exercised strict control over its citizens, limiting rights and freedoms in ways that were oppressive but highly effective against foreign espionage. One CIA officer in the early 1950s famously remarked that recruiting an agent with access to sensitive Soviet information was about as difficult as sending a spy to Mars. As a result, U.S. knowledge of Soviet military planning in those years was dangerously limited, serious risk in the tense Cold War environment. In 1953, in Vienna, an unidentified man approached an American diplomat and handed him an envelope. The letter, written in Russian, came from a GRU major named Pyotr Popov, stationed in Vienna. He offered his services to the Americans. For several years, Popov was the CIA's most valuable Soviet source, providing a trove of classified materials, including detailed plans for the USSR's use of nuclear weapons in wartime. But in 1958, suspected of treason, he was recalled to Moscow, interrogated and exposed. He was initially used as a double agent to pass disinformation back to the Americans. He managed to send the CIA a brief warning of his capture before being tried and executed by firing squad. In 1961, another remarkable figure emerged, Oleg Penkovsky, a GRU colonel operating under the cover of a senior position in the State Committee for Scientific Research. On numerous overseas trips, he conducted secret missions to obtain Western technology. At a reception in Moscow, he slipped a letter to a British businessman, appealing to both the US and UK for contact. Over the next several years, Penkovsky supplied the CIA with over 6,000 photographs of classified Soviet military documents. Its intelligence was crucial during the Cuban Missile Crisis, giving the West accurate information on missile locations and Soviet military capabilities. In late 1962, Penkovsky vanished. Soon, it became clear that he was under KGB suspicion. Hidden cameras were installed in his apartment, and a search uncovered espionage tools and other proof of collaboration. His 1963 trial was public, heavily covered by Soviet media. That same year, he was executed by firing squad. Penkovsky's downfall nearly froze CIA activity in Moscow for years. The number of operatives under diplomatic cover dwindled to just a handful. Fear persisted that any valuable recruit might actually be a KGB plant. This caution held until the mid-1970s, when a new generation of bolder CIA officers began pushing for more aggressive operations. In January 1977, Robert Fulton, head of the CIA's Moscow station, was refueling his car at a gas station often used by foreign diplomats. As he returned to his vehicle, a stout, middle-aged man in a fur hat approached him. Speaking in English, he asked, "Are you American? I need to talk to you." Then, switching to Russian, he apologized, handed Fulton a note, and walked away. The entire exchange lasted less than 15 seconds. Inside the note was a brief message in Russian. The writer wished to meet discreetly with a U.S. Embassy representative about urgent matters. He included a detailed plan for the meeting. Fulton read the note in a secure room on the embassy's 7th floor, the only place where American operatives could let down their guard. Outside that space, even within the embassy, they had to remain in cover at all times. According to the documents, they operated under diplomatic cover as official employees of the American embassy. For the most part, these agents were engaged in routine bureaucratic duties, fully aware that they were under constant surveillance, not only outside the diplomatic representative office, but even within the embassy itself. The majority of the service staff there were Soviet citizens, and some of them secretly provided intelligence to the KGB. Fulton promptly reported the note and his encounter with the mysterious stranger at the gas station to CIA headquarters in Langley. The response from headquarters was clear. Avoid contact, could easily be a trap. A few weeks later, the same stranger again approached Fulton's vehicle, this time just outside the U.S. Embassy building in Moscow. He handed over another note, once again suggesting a meeting and providing coordinates, but offering no further details. The CIA still decided against initiating contact. Several more weeks passed before the man delivered a new letter to the chief of the residency. This time, the contents were more revealing. The stranger acknowledged the American's reluctance and identified himself as an engineer employed at a restricted defense-related facility. He again proposed a date and location for a meeting. Fulton, the head of the Moscow residency, began to suspect the man was not working for the KGB after all. A KGB operative would likely not make so many determined attempts to pass along the same message. Still, CIA headquarters remained doubtful. The odds seemed implausible. What were the chances that a stranger would randomly approach a car in a diplomatic parking lot and, by sheer coincidence, encounter the head of the Moscow station? Fulton believed it truly was coincidence, reasoning that the man had simply chosen the first vehicle with American plates. Despite Fulton's confidence, headquarters once again refused contact. Several months later, Fulton even ignored the man's attempt to pass him a package. This heightened caution was due in part to the fact that, in just the past year, the CIA had lost several valuable Soviet agents, including high-ranking contacts inside the USSR. One of the most prominent cases was that of Alexander Ogrodnik, a Soviet diplomat who had been recruited while serving in Colombia. Ogrodnik had an appetite for luxury and agreed to work with the Americans in exchange for generous compensation. Shortly after his initial recruitment, he was reassigned to a more senior post in Moscow, where he continued passing information to the CIA. The exchanges often took place through dead drops, prearranged hiding spots where secret documents, kata, or other intelligence could be left for later retrieval. This system also worked in reverse, allowing the CIA to deliver items to the agent. Though an old espionage method, it was considered relatively safe at the time. In Ogrodnik's case, meetings were avoided entirely. However, in 1977, the KGB arrested an American embassy employee while she was attempting to retrieve a package from him. She was secretly working for the CIA. It was later revealed that Ogrodnik had been detained earlier and during interrogation had swallowed a lethal capsule concealed inside a pen provided by the Americans. The embassy employee was immediately declared persona non grata and expelled from the USSR. Such incidents showed that when an operation failed, the CIA risked losing both the recruited agent and their undercover operative. This explained the headquarters' extreme caution toward an unknown man's repeated attempts to pass letters to embassy staff. It was a KGB trap. The agency could lose another operative in Moscow without gaining any valuable intelligence. Nearly a year after the initial gas station encounter, the man made 2 more attempts to deliver a message to a car with American plates at the same location. This time, he encountered regular embassy employees who passed his letter on to the CIA. In that message, the stranger boldly revealed his identity. I, Tolkachev, Adolf Tolkachev, have been employed at the Scientific Research Institute of Radio Engineering since 1954, currently holding the position of chief designer. Both letters were extensive, outlining his biography, listing the full names of his wife and 12-year-old son, and providing his home and work phone numbers, as well as his residential address. He expressed his willingness to share details about the latest secret radar project he was working on at the Design Bureau. After verifying the information, CIA headquarters concluded that Tolkachev could be trusted. He potentially had highly valuable intelligence, and a meeting needed to be arranged. He was given the code name V.I. In 1976, Soviet pilot Viktor Belenko had made a daring escape. Flying his MiG-25 interceptor from a far eastern airfield to Japan before defecting to the United States in exchange for political asylum, Belenko provided American intelligence with critical information on advanced fighter aircraft and radar technology. Tolkachev, a regular listener to Voice of America, rare source of uncensored news for Soviet citizens, had learned about Belenko's defection from those broadcasts. In one of his letters to the CIA, he stated openly that he wished to do something similar. He also described in detail how the MiG-25's design had been modified after Belenko's escape. "Hey," and he offered to provide information on the latest radar developments. Radar had long been a weakness for the Soviet armed forces. Existing systems struggled to detect low-flying aircraft or missiles, a flaw that gave the United States a strategic advantage. Access to such information made the CIA far more inclined to meet with Tolkachev. It was unlikely that the KGB would disclose such critical vulnerabilities merely to ensnare another American agent. Tolkachev was assigned a handlerless CIA officer responsible for direct communication with an agent, whether in person or by phone. That handler was John Gilsher, an American born to Russian immigrant parents who had fled after the revolution. Thanks to his upbringing, Gilsher spoke near-perfect Russian, slight accent suggesting Lithuanian or Estonian origins rather than American. After serving in the U.S. Army, Gilsher joined the CIA and was eventually posted to Moscow. His first task, establish contact with the new agent. The CIA had Tolkachev's home phone number, but calling from the embassy was out of the question. The KGB kept American diplomats under constant watch-bugging their apartments, tapping embassy lines, planting listening devices in clothing and typewriters, and tailing them in public. To avoid this, CIA officers in Moscow relied on public payphones. Gilsher and his wife devised a plan. They would attend a performance at the Bolshoi Theater. During an intermission, Gilsher slipped away to place a call to Tolkachev, while his wife kept their Soviet colleague, in reality, a KGB operative, distracted inside the theater. In that brief call, Gilsher told Tolkachev that the agency had received his letters and would be in touch soon with further instructions. The KGB officer remained oblivious. In their next communication, CIA provided Tolkachev with coordinates to collect a package containing detailed instructions. It would be hidden near a phone booth inside a work glove. Tolkachev successfully retrieved it, finding inside a step-by-step plan for transferring classified information to the CIA. This plan involved what they called a secret letter, a forged message supposedly sent from an American tourist in Moscow to her grandfather in the United States. Tolkachev was to use carbon paper to write his intelligence on the reverse side of the letter's pages, encoding the data into a cipher. The letter would then be mailed to a false American address controlled by the CIA. The KGB would almost certainly open the envelope for inspection, as this was standard procedure for foreign correspondence. However, the Soviet special services were unlikely to detect the hidden coded text. It was invisible to the naked eye. Even if they somehow discovered it, decryption would be impossible without the special table that only Tolkachev and the CIA possessed. A few weeks later, the CIA's Moscow residency received Tolkachev's letter. It bore clear signs of having been opened, but the secret code remained intact. Using it, the agent conveyed highly sensitive intelligence on the Soviet Union's latest developments in radar technology, targeting systems, and test results, information of immense value to the Americans. Moreover, Tolkachev had flawlessly followed every instruction for preparing the message. It was now time to meet him in person, an essential step to establish closer contact and negotiate the terms of cooperation. However, arranging a face-to-face meeting with an informant inside the Soviet Union was fraught with risk. Leak could trigger a major diplomatic scandal. Still, the CIA judged the meeting necessary. A Soviet insider with direct access to classified military developments had long been a coveted target, and Tolkachev could prove to be that invaluable source. By the late 1970s, Adolf Tolkachev had turned 50. In Soviet society, he was considered highly successful as chief designer at the Fitron Bureau Research Institute, working for the military-industrial complex. His professional standing was secure. A photograph from that period captures his status. The American embassy stands prominently in the foreground, while Tolkachev's apartment occupied a high-rise nearby prime housing reserved for those in influential positions. At their first personal meeting, CIA officer John Gilsher's main question was about Tolkachev's motivation. Why take such a perilous risk? Initially evasive, Tolkachev said it was a complicated matter that would take time to explain. Then concluded simply, He was a dissident by nature. The discussion then turned to financial matters. Tolkachev cited the case of pilot Viktor Belenko and requested the same compensation he had received from the United States. Gilsher replied that he did not know Belenko's exact reward and handed over a few hundred rubles, assuring him the CIA could provide a similar amount monthly. Tolkachev countered, asking for 10,000 rubles. Although both sums seemed modest, they carried significant risk. In his position, Tolkachev earned over 300 rubles per month, several times the average salary of a Soviet engineer. He later admitted that money mattered less to him than the symbolic recognition it represented. Due to chronic shortages, even in Moscow, many consumer goods were simply unavailable. At that first meeting, Tolkachev gave Gilsher a notebook filled with fresh, secret data. He suggested that if the CIA provided him with a camera, he could photograph documents, particularly after hours, when colleagues had left rather than laboriously copying and sketching them by hand. The two men spent about 40 minutes together, strolling through the dark, empty streets of a January night in Moscow. Afterward, Gilsher reported to his superiors that the new agent demonstrated both responsibility and a willingness to continue cooperation. For future meetings, the CIA devised a special plan. Several rendezvous locations, all near Tolkachev's home, were assigned Russian first names such as Valera or Nina. Before a meeting, a CIA officer would call Tolkachev's apartment and ask for Valera. His response that the caller had the wrong number would be the signal to leave for the agreed location. Over the following meetings, Tolkachev continued delivering valuable intelligence, including critical technical details on the newly developed Su-27 fighter jet. The CIA agreed to give him a miniature camera and half his requested payment, 5,000 rubles. However, his demands escalated. At the next meeting, he requested a poison capsule in case of capture, and significantly increased his financial demand to a 6-figure sum in US dollars, citing a Voice of America report about Belenko's reward. For the CIA, these new demands posed challenges. Providing a poison capsule to a relatively new agent carried high risks. It could be used impulsively in a non-threatening situation, and its discovery by authorities would immediately condemn him. The 6-figure dollar amount was enormous for the era, especially given that in the Soviet black market, $1 was worth several rubles. First, the Moscow station needed to convince CIA headquarters in Langley that Tolkachev's intelligence justified the expense. Second, they had to solve the logistical problem of storing such funds without raising suspicion. Ultimately, the CIA withheld the poison capsule but agreed to the financial terms. As the Americans analyzed the data, they realized Tolkachev's intelligence could save their own military-industrial complex tens of millions of dollars by allowing better allocation of resources. The agent's methodical approach impressed them further. In one letter to his handler, outlined a detailed 12-year plan describing what information he could provide and the time and resources required. His stated goal was simple: to inflict maximum damage on the Soviet Union. In 1979, the CIA supplied Tolkachev with the Mali cameras smaller than a matchbox to make his work easier. Until then, he had been forced to copy documents by hand. Since photocopiers at his institute were under constant guard to prevent espionage, only authorized personnel could enter the copying room, and every use of the machines was logged in detail. Removing documents from the building was strictly forbidden, but Tolkachev learned to bypass these rules. He would smuggle papers under his coat during lunch breaks, take them home to photograph or copy, and return them before the end of the break. His first attempt with the Mali camera failed due to poor lighting, making the images unreadable. In response, the CIA provided him with a Drapel camera no larger than an AA battery and a Pentax as backup. That year, Gilsher met Tolkachev 5 times. Each meeting required elaborate counter-surveillance measures. The KGB was well aware that certain U.S. embassy staff worked for the CIA, and sometimes even knew exactly who they were. As a result, surveillance was constant. Before each meeting, Gilcher had to confirm he was not being followed. Sometimes, a CIA officer would pretend to leave the Soviet Union on a foreign trip, only to return unexpectedly, exploiting the delay in communication between border guards and KGB operatives. This gave a narrow window, just a few hours, to meet undetected. Disguises and advanced evasion techniques taught in specialized CIA training were also used. In general, the CIA preferred to limit face-to-face exchanges, but Tolkachev valued them highly, and the agency increasingly accommodated his preference as his importance grew. Equipped with cameras, his productivity soared. At meetings, he delivered hundreds of pages of secret notes, along with countless rolls of film containing photographs of sensitive documents and technical blueprints. This included highly classified radar advancements for the MiG-25 aircraft, as well as sensitive details on the state of missile defense, along with strategic documentation outlining the development of specific military aircraft systems projected through the year 1990. Tolkachev was fully aware of the immense value he held for the CIA. Gilcher had already delivered substantial bundles of cash during their meetings, totaling more than 100,000 rubles. Yet, seasoned agent once again raised the stakes. He admitted that during their previous negotiation, he had misstated his needs. Instead of a six-figure sum, he now demanded an amount with 6 zeros, meaning millions. Such an unprecedented request sent ripples through CIA headquarters in Langley. Never before in the agency's history had an operative been offered such an astronomical payout. After extensive internal deliberations, the CIA agreed they would provide him with $200,000 up front, followed by an annual payment of $300,000. The reasoning was straightforward. Tolkachev's intelligence was worth every cent. The material he was supplying would retain operational relevance for the next 8 to 10 years. By the early 1980s, Air Force specialists estimated that the classified information obtained from Agent Sphere had a value approaching $2 billion. Tolkachev officially became known as the billion-dollar spy. In the USSR, Forbes magazine was unavailable, and no such publication could ever have printed a list of the world's most highly paid spies. Forbes could not have reported that a relatively obscure Soviet-designed bureau engineer was earning more than the President of the United States. The 1970s and early 1980s in the Soviet Union were widely remembered as the era of stagnation. The primary concern for citizens was not how to earn money, but how to acquire goods amidst chronic shortages. Tolkachev could scarcely have spent the vast sums the CIA provided. Much of the rubles he received, along with espionage equipment, were simply stored away in a closet at home, noticed by his wife and son. From the Americans, he also received rare and desirable goods nearly impossible to obtain in the Soviet Union: books by banned, dissident authors, quality razors, French medicines, Czech stationery, and records of Western rock bands for his son, among other items. Part of his payment was also deposited into a special foreign bank account. The CIA then offered Tolkachev the possibility of exfiltration, a covert operation to smuggle him out of the USSR. Initially, he did not take this proposal seriously, but over time he began to consider it. Even so, there was never any discussion of an immediate escape. For the Americans, it was vital to keep their prized source active for as long as possible. Furthermore, exfiltration was a complex process requiring over a year of preparation. And the Moscow CIA station had only one precedent in 1980, when KGB Major Viktor Shemov, along with his wife and daughter, secretly crossed into Finland, hidden inside a car by CIA operatives, before being transported to the United States. A year earlier, Shemov had contacted the CIA in Moscow, disillusioned with the Soviet regime, with the condition that his cooperation depended on an escape to the West. After his successful extraction, the KGB assumed for several months that their officer and his family had been victims of common crime and had disappeared. This operation was the first assignment in Moscow for a young CIA officer named David Rolfe, who was just over 30 years old. Rolfe would later become Tolkachev's new handler. One evening in October 1980, David Rolfe and his wife entered the American embassy in Moscow. A policeman at the entrance logged their arrival. Rolfe immediately proceeded to the technical specialist room, where he changed clothes and applied makeup to resemble a member of the embassy's technical staff. A category of employees the KGB monitored far less than suspected CIA agents. Disguised, Rolfe left the building and followed standard CIA counter-surveillance protocols, riding a tram, visiting a flower shop, boarding a bus, and walking down the street while constantly scanning vehicles, pedestrians, and fellow passengers for signs of pursuit. At one point, he dashed into a residential entranceway and climbed the stairs, deliberately inviting any possible tails to follow. He waited nothing. The entire surveillance detection run lasted about 90 minutes. At 9 p.m., Rolfe reached the agreed meeting point for his first encounter with Agent Sphere. After introductions, they discussed operational matters. Rolfe informed Tolkachev that his repeated request for a suicide capsule, cyanide pill, had finally been approved, and that he would receive it at an upcoming meeting. Tolkachev had been pressing for this for some time, but the agency had always refused until now. One reason for this change was the increasing risk he faced. To obtain secret documents from the Institute's storage, employees had to sign for them on his own initiative, and at the CIA's request, Tolkachev had already signed out many documents unrelated to his own work. If the KGB were to cross-check those signatures, his activities would be immediately exposed. Security procedures had also tightened. Retrieving documents from the repository now required leaving one's pass there. The pass was also necessary to enter the building. Tolkachev could no longer smuggle documents out during lunch breaks to photograph them at home. At the meeting, he told Rolfe he had found a workaround through an acquaintance in the repository who would provide him documents without requiring a pass. When asked if this was risky, Tolkachev replied dryly, "Everything is dangerous." Began preparations to create a duplicate pass for him, but until then, he would continue taking risks. In 1981, however, Tolkachev's cover was blown not by the KGB or his superiors, but by his own wife. Natalia Tolkacheva discovered a camera and other CIA equipment at home after he failed to hide them during lunch. She immediately realized her husband was engaged in espionage. Tolkachev did not deny it, but falsely claimed he was working for the KGB. Concerned for their safety, Natalia urged him to stop. He promised he would, but it was a lie. Ironically, Natalia herself was indirectly responsible for her husband's recruitment. Born Natalia Kuzmina, she was the daughter of Ivan Kuzmin, editor of the industrial newspaper Light Industry, and his wife Sofia, a Ukrainian Jew. Sofia's father had emigrated to Denmark and established a successful business there. After visiting him in Europe, Sofia was arrested in 1937 during Stalin's Great Purge. Merely having a relative abroad was enough for suspicion. Accused of belonging to a Trotskyist group, she was executed within months. Ivan was arrested a week later and spent 10 years in the Gulag. Their 2-year-old daughter, Natalia, was placed in an orphanage. Ivan was released in 1947 and rehabilitated a year before his death in the mid-1950s, at which point he revealed to Natalia the truth about her parents' fate. Tolkachev knew his wife had refused to sign a public letter supporting the USSR's 1968 invasion of Czechoslovakia, and that she held deep resentment toward the Soviet regime. Her family's tragic history became one of the key factors motivating his cooperation with the CIA. Born in the late 1920s in Kazakhstan, Tolkachev moved to Moscow with his family in early childhood. After graduating from college, he was assigned to the Radio Engineering Research Institute, known as Phasatron, the only workplace he would ever have. He was not overtly political, yet he read banned literature, followed dissident figures like Sakharov and Solzhenitsyn, and listened to Voice of America broadcasts. His desire to strike at the Soviet system grew slowly, but decisively. till a well-known incident involving a pilot named Belenko convinced him that his greatest weapon against the USSR was secrecy itself. Documents, reports, diagrams, and other vital intelligence about the military industry were among the materials he supplied. In one of his letters to the CIA, he openly admitted that he had never been to the United States and, in general, did not romanticize the country. However, he did have the impression that he could live there. Because of this, Tolkachev decided to pass highly classified information specifically to the Americans. In 1982, the leadership at the CIA's Moscow station changed. The new leadership placed particular emphasis on so-called deep cover agents. Generally, CIA employees worked under genuine diplomatic cover, performing routine embassy tasks. Deep covered agents, however, entered the country disguised as service workers. Initially, the KGB monitored these individuals far less closely. For some time after arriving in Moscow, such agents lived an unremarkable and repetitive existence, commuting between work and home, occasionally visiting the skating rink on Sundays. This monotony caused Soviet intelligence services to lose interest in them. Moreover, deep cover agents were always fresh recruits. They had not served at CIA stations in other countries, so the KGB had no prior information about them. It was with these types of CIA operatives that Tolkachev now made contact. Although he had been provided with a special radio transmitter to communicate remotely with the Americans, he insisted on meeting in person. CIA agents arranged to meet him either on the street or in his recently purchased car. Despite tightened security measures at his institute, Tolkachev continued to supply the CIA with hundreds of invaluable photographs, documents, and diagrams during nearly every encounter. However, by mid-1982, something unusual occurred. Tolkachev missed several scheduled meetings, and a few others were canceled due to suspicions of KGB surveillance. Eventually, CIA officers attempted to call him at home, but received no answer. Within the Moscow station, tension mounted. There had been no word from their most valuable spy for months. At the beginning of December, another meeting was scheduled. To ensure the KGB could not follow them, the CIA prepared a complex evasion maneuver called Jack in the Box. An officer successfully slipped surveillance and met Tolkachev. He apologized, explaining that he had been unwell with high blood pressure and had therefore fallen out of the routine. Nevertheless, he arrived carrying numerous records and rolls of film containing photographs of secret documents. By early 1983, CIA had finalized an exfiltration plan to take Tolkachev and his family to the United States. However, Tolkachev ultimately rejected the plan. He spoke of acquaintances who had immigrated to Israel and later wrote about longing for their homeland. He realized he could not live in another country, or even in another city. With that, the Americans set aside the escape plan, seeing some advantage in leaving their valuable agent in place. In April 1983, Tolkachev was called in by his institute's management for what seemed a routine matter. While there, a phone call came in from the institute's security chief who reported directly to the KGB. He requested a list of personnel who had worked on a specific radar system. Just 1 month earlier, Tolkachev had passed information about this exact radar to the CIA. Shaken, Tolkachev returned to his office wondering how the KGB had found out. Was there a mole inside the CIA? Or had someone at the institute grown suspicious of him? The next day, he took sick leave. He gathered bundles of cash, cameras, the CIA transmitter, dissident literature, and foreign goods, loaded them into his car, drove out of town, burned the evidence, and scattered the remaining metal parts from his car window on the way back to Moscow. The following day, before entering his manager's office, Tolkachev discreetly removed a poison capsule from his pen and placed it under his tongue. Convinced KGB officers would be waiting to arrest him, but it turned out to be another routine matter. Over the next several weeks, he repeated this ritual, carrying the poison capsule to every meeting at the institute and to every encounter with CIA officers. Weeks and months passed, yet no word came about the KGB investigation or what it had been about. One thing remained certain. Under no circumstances would Adolf Tolkachev allow himself to be captured alive. In the late 1970s, Edward Lee Howard, 28-year-old, working at a consulting firm in Chicago, sought adventure and change. He applied to the CIA, completed the required training and tests, and was accepted. In 1982, he was assigned to the Moscow station. Before leaving, he underwent additional preparation, which included limited access to certain documents from the CIA's Moscow branch, likely including the codename Sphere. Whether he knew Tolkachev's true identity is uncertain. Just before departure, Howard failed a polygraph test, and repeated tests produced the same result. He had concealed minor past offenses, and the CIA already knew of his drinking problem. He was removed from the Moscow assignment and eventually fired, signing a confidentiality agreement before leaving. Resentful, Howard traveled to Europe, contacted Soviet embassy officials, and agreed to sell them classified information for $60,000. Among the details he revealed was that a valuable CIA source within a Soviet military research institute existed. Even without a name, the KGB could identify him. It was only a matter of time. By 1984, despite worsening health and lingering fears about the institute's investigation, Tolkachev continued his work for the CIA. To avoid detection, he sometimes photographed documents inside the institute's poorly lit restroom, resulting in many unusable images. Even so, his intelligence remained of immense value. At one meeting, a CIA officer informed him that his foreign bank account now held nearly $2 million. In March 1985, he was scheduled to meet again, but failed to appear. For months, the CIA left signals for new meetings. He never showed. A June meeting was canceled due to heavy KGB surveillance. Days later, while returning to Moscow with his wife after a trip out of town, their car was stopped by traffic police. As Tolkachev stepped out with his papers, several men rushed him, seized him, and dragged him to a nearby vehicle. They were not traffic officers, they were KGB operatives. The day before, Soviet intelligence had searched his apartment, finding cameras, a receiver, cash, poison, and records irrefutable evidence of his espionage. A week later, at another planned meeting, a CIA officer spotted Tolkachev's car, but before he could approach, several large men ambushed him, shoved him into a car, and interrogated him. They found hidden cameras, bundles of cash, and other incriminating items. That night, he was declared persona non grata and expelled from the USSR. The Moscow CIA station understood immediately if the KGB had known the exact time and place of the meeting. There was only one explanation. The billion-dollar spy's career was over. In August 1985, a Soviet KGB officer defected in Rome and told U.S. authorities about a source inside Soviet intelligence known as Robert. This man had been a CIA recruit bound for Moscow who had failed his tests and been dismissed. Could only be Edward Lee Howard. The FBI interrogated Howard, who denied involvement, but they placed him under constant surveillance. He nonetheless slipped away, flew to Europe, and eventually reached the Soviet Union, where he was granted asylum. In the 1990s, he published memoirs denying any role in Tolkachev's capture. In the early 2000s, at age 50, Howard died after a fall in his Moscow apartment. In 1986, Adolf Tolkachev was sentenced to death. On the eve of his execution, he was allowed to see his son and asked for forgiveness. His son told him there was nothing to forgive. In October 1986, the Soviet news agency TASS announced his execution for espionage and treason. His wife, Natalia, was sentenced to 3 years in prison for knowing of his activities and not reporting them. She was released in 1987, but in March 1991, she died of cancer. That December, the Soviet Union ceased to exist.